Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. On today's show, we're going to be talking with Frank Larson about a new book that's out, Frank's Extra Mile, A Gentleman's Story. But as we get started, we have the man here himself. Mr. Larson, thanks so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
As we get started, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and your background.
Well, I'm 90 years old. I was born in Valley City, and I've lived in Valley City all my life.
You have? And tell us a little bit more about how you lived in Valley City. Tell us about your parents and growing up there.
Well, my father was an attorney, but he practiced law for just a short time after law school, and he wound up going to Bismarck as he called himself private secretary of the governor, but I think it was probably executive director now or whatever the titles are. And then he left in 1927 and moved to Valley City to manage the Agricultural Credit Company, making loans to farmers in the area. My dad graduated from the University of Minnesota Law School. My mother graduated from the University of North Dakota, I think in 1913, and she wound up being superintendent of schools in Nelson County. So they both had, they were very poor to begin with, and they realized instinctively that in order to do better in life, to better enjoy life, they had to have an education. So they both, really on their own, got an education, put themselves through college. So, of course, the emphasis was on learning in our family growing up.
Mm-hmm. Well, this book's a little bit about your story, and of course about Starion Bank. Of course, you own that, and but how did you get into banking? Did you start out to think you were going to own a bank?
Well, actually, I finished law school up at the University of North Dakota, and I went home and I intended to be a farmer. But my dad, during the winter, when I was going to law school, my final year, he rented all the land out, so there was no land to farm. So the first year, we were managing his farmland, but it was all rented, so we had very little to do. About a year later, a fine old gentleman in Valley City asked me if I'd like to practice law with him. So for 5 or 6 years, I practiced law, and there were a couple in Valley City that bought the bank at Dickey, North Dakota, with the intention of moving it to Valley City. Well, they got everything done except FDIC approval. And the FDIC director in Minneapolis told them that there was no way they would ever get the bank in because he didn't like some of their background. And I had been involved with one of them hopefully developing shopping centers. And that didn't work out very well. So I had money involved with them already, so I wound up owning the bank in Dickey. That was quite an experience. And I moved it to Valley City. During that time that I was doing that, a friend of mine, a medical doctor in Oaks, called me and he said, "You should come down and look at the bank here." He said, "They're fine people running the bank, but they just don't make loans. They're not helping the bank, the community at all." So I went down and spent a half a day with him, just going around town and meeting people in the bank. Well, the word got out that I was buying the bank. And the chairman of the bank was very unhappy about that, so he put a notice in the paper that the bank had not been sold and was never going to be sold. So I kept on working the people in the bank. I'll never forget one night, I didn't tell anybody, I didn't even tell my wife where I was going when I went down to Oaks because I didn't want the word to get out again. So the vice president of the bank was the one I was contacting. And I knocked on his door about 8 o'clock one night. And his wife answered the door, and I said, "I'd like to see Carl." And she said, "Well, Carl's working on the back in her garden." So Carl came to the door, and the first thing he said was, "What do you want now?" Well, anyway, I kept at it, and finally they decided they would sell the bank to me. And it was kind of interesting because, of course, I had no money whatsoever. And through the working with the bank, moving to Valley City, I met Carl Pohlad in Minneapolis. And Carl had a bank there, and dealing with him through moving to Valley City, he agreed to finance me 100% on the bank at Oaks. It was a kind of a strange operation, really. He did the same thing a year later when bought the bank at Ellendale. So I wound up owning two banks and owing a lot of money on them. And I'll never forget, one day I was visiting with my dad. We had a cup of coffee, and we were sitting in a drugstore drinking coffee, and he asked me, he said, "How much did you pay for the two banks?" And I said, $1 million. And he blew his coffee all over the table. And he said, "You can't do it." He said, "There's no way you can pay that kind of money back." Well, again, that's kind of a story, because he made the agreement with me that for 2 years I would not have to make any principal payments, just pay the interest. Well, paying interest was no problem because I could deduct that on taxes. So at the end of 2 years, I still had no money. And he started talking about principal. Well, then I went to the First National Bank in Minneapolis, and they made the same deal with me for 2 years. So, and then during that period of time, I bought a third bank, Bowbells, North Dakota, and they made the same deal with me. But at the end of 4 years then, I still had no money. I had a nice financial statement. The bank was getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So at the end of 6 years then, when they started talking about principal, or 2 years, 4 years, they talked about principal reduction. I then went to Northwestern Bank in Minneapolis, and they gave me the same deal for 2 years. Well, at the end of 2 years again, I still didn't have any money, so I went to a bank in Aberdeen, South Dakota, and they gave me the same deal. Well, of course, again, when the time came, I had no money. So I then went to the Bank of North Dakota, and they made a deal with me at 2 years without principal. Well, again, I had no money. So at the end of 10 years now, I went back to Northwestern Bank in Minneapolis, and they made me the deal. I thought I was pretty clever because I thought, boy, this is really something. I've got these banks, and they're growing like weeds, and I'm not paying anything on principal. But this was in the 12th year happened to be at the time when we had a terrible period in North Dakota. The savings loans around the country failed, and the banks failed, and the crops in North Dakota were terrible. There no rain, especially in Dickey County. We were the first county hit. So one morning, I had an interest in a bank in Dickinson, and I was getting ready in a motel in Bismarck, Dickinson, to go to that bank meeting, and I had a call in my motel room. The fellow that I worked with in Minneapolis in the correspondence department called, and he said, "We had a meeting yesterday, and we want you to take all your business out of the bank and pay us off in full and take your business somewhere else." Well, unfortunately, nobody would take me. I went to Minneapolis, Chicago, Denver, Kansas City, and nobody would do business with me. And the thing I learned on that was that it's fine to do those type of things, but I had no loyalty to anybody, and they knew this. Fortunately, things got better, and Norwest didn't call me to say, "Look, get your stuff out of the bank." In fact, we turned around enough so that during that period of time, probably this would probably be in the year 13 or 14, they made a commitment to me to buy a bank, and they committed, I think it was $13-14 million to buy this bank. So I was really doing well. Things were going good. And that at the same time, then I was able to get a holding company, and there's some terrific tax advantages of having a holding company. So from that time on, my problems were pretty well solved.
Well, so it didn't happen overnight, as we can find out. But then, let's talk a little bit about the book here for a moment. We want to acknowledge that Patrick McCluskey from the University of Mary was the author of the book.
Right.
But how did the book come about? How did Pat contact you and say they wanted to do a book about you?
I didn't talk to Pat directly at that time. He talked with my son Craig, running the bank, and most of the work was done between Craig and the people in the bank. I met Pat occasionally and so on and so forth, but actually the bulk of the work was done by Craig and people in the bank.
Okay, so so a lot of the research was done just through the archives and through the history of your family, I guess. But you've told us about the origins of what is now Starion Bank, and I believe they're marking about 50 years in business.
50 years this year.
So you talked about the first 10 or 12 years there, and you never made a principal payment, it sounds like, but yet now you're in business for 50 years. How many branches are out there now? How many banks do you have?
I think we have 15 branches, and we're in 9 towns and cities.
Mm-hmm. Where did the name Starion come from?
Well, that took a lot of work because we wanted, well, I suppose something different. We wanted something to kind of show that guiding by the stars to help people and do better. So that was really how it came about.
Yeah, well, what is it that differentiates one bank from another?
Well, there really is nothing. We all offer the same thing. I guess I like to think that we care about people and we're there to help people. That's the only thing I've added to the bank, I think, to my life during the banking time, was that we've been very, very concerned. We like to deal with people, or we like to treat people the way we would like to be treated. And our goal, and the banking goal, is to help people get started with farming, with their businesses, buy a house, whatever it might be. That's our job.
Mm-hmm. You talked about the first 10 or 12 years and getting started. Can you talk a little bit more about the ups and downs with your career and with the bank and getting it all to where it is today?
I didn't realize what I was getting into, of course, because, well, I had no knowledge how a bank operates, and I still don't, as far as that goes. But actually things, well, it was a constant struggle until I got the bank holding company to meet my obligations and this type of thing. There were things, a couple of things along the way that helped. I got involved with a man from Denver. We were financial consultants to cities and school boards around the state. And the time that we got started was the prime time to refinance outstanding bond issues. And in doing that, we saved the cities and the communities and school boards a lot of money. But at the same time, we made a lot of money ourselves. So that money came in at the right time to help me keep on going. But we've had, since my time in banking, there have been 3 or 4, serious down circles. In the banks, it seems that sometimes we're our own worst enemies because we make loans, we fight for loans, and then when bad times come, why, we're vulnerable to having troubles. There have been 3 or 4 of those times during the time I've been in banking. And that can be very unsettling because all of a sudden you've got a lot of loans that... I had a good friend in Aberdeen, South Dakota. He was a banker. And I was talking with him one day, and he asked me, he said, "How loaned up are you at Oaks and Elledale?" And I said, "Well, we're loaned up 105%. He said, "That's way too much," he said. So I said to him, "Well," I said, "what are you going to do?" I said, "The loans are all good loans." "Yes," he said, "they're all good until they go bad." And I found that out the hard way, that that's true.
Yeah. Was that during the 80s some with the ag?
That was the 80s was the worst time.
Yes, sir.
But there've been a couple others, not quite as severe, but bad times for banking.
Yeah. Well, there's a chapter in the book that says, "What did Frank actually do?" Can you tell us about this chapter and what it's about?
Well, I like to think that, you know, a part of the book it talked about the fact that that I didn't work in the bank, but I kind of set the tone for the bank. And I think that, I guess I look at life very simply. It's in banking, you're there to help people. Well, I think we've done a good job doing that. And I think you have to be honest and open with people. If there are troubles, we've done our very best to keep everybody going. And I think I got that partly from my dad. My dad had a loan portfolio with his agricultural credit company, had loans to farmers in North and South Dakota during the 20s. Mm-hmm. And of course, they had a lot of loans out, and he was very proud of the fact that he had to foreclose on only 3 farmers during all that time, which was really unbelievable that that could be done that way. But he did, you know, working with the farmers and trying to help them and set out the programs. So I think that we've tried to do the same thing in our banking. And I guess I've just tried to set a tone for the people who work in the bank that, look, we want to be helpful. And banking is very simple, really, because you take in money from the people in their savings and all, and you loan it back out again.
Yeah, and you and I were talking off camera. You never actually worked in the bank. You just owned the banks.
Right.
You know, how can you own a bank and never work in a bank?
Well, it's different. But fortunately, it worked out for me anyway, doing it this way. I don't think I could have been as successful working in the bank. In fact, some of the people working for me said that it's a good thing I didn't work in the bank because I could never say no. I would loan money to anybody all the time. And I think there's a certain amount of truth to that. But my role was really kind of to set the tone and to hopefully encourage people to do their best.
Okay. Well, of course, yeah, since you didn't work in the banking, you were a lawyer, but can you talk about your career in the state legislature?
Well, that was kind of a strange thing too, because we had a state senator in our district and 2 representatives, of course. The state senator was a Republican. The 2 House members were Democrats. Well, I'd always had an interest in politics. In fact, earlier I tried for the endorsement for governor in North Dakota. So I had a lot of friends and people around the state. Another fellow and I got the endorsement to run locally for the House of Representatives, and in a Democratic landslide across the country, we were elected to the House of Representatives. 2 years later, it was a Republican landslide, and we were voted out. So I think that, well, I think that one of the things that happened at that time that caused that too was that Earl Pomeroy came back to Valley City, and he of course ran a very tough campaign, and I think that was a big part of the fact that we lost our election.
Okay. Well, and understand you've worked with John Hoeven, 2 different John Hoevens. What about your relationship with John Hoeven and the Bank of North Dakota?
Well, I knew John Hoeven's father quite well because we were both bankers and both active in politics at one time. And I've known John for a long time. In fact, I talked with John. I suppose I started talking with him seriously when he was running the Bank of North Dakota. And John appointed me to serve as the director of the Bank of North Dakota on the advisory board. And I think that I was on the advisory board for 16 or 17 years. Mm. And I told John that when he was just starting as governor, been in for a year or so. I told him, I said, John, I said, you might do a great job as governor, but what you did with the Bank of North Dakota was probably the greatest thing ever. Because John was really the first one that really set the Bank of North Dakota on the course to accomplish what it was truly intended to do.
Okay. Well, let's go back to your family for just a moment. Obviously, tell us about your family, your wife, and your children.
Well, my wife grew up in Cooperstown, and we were married in 1955, and we have 4 children. The oldest is name is Scott. He lives in Oklahoma, self-employed there. The second one is our daughter Heidi. I have a little dog, so she flew back with me from Phoenix to help with the dog. So she just went back home last night. She's well, self-employed. And then I have a son, Mike, who lives here in Fargo, and he again is self-employed. Mike and Heidi both worked in the banks for a while, but they decided they'd rather do some other things than that. And then, of course, Craig is youngest, and Craig runs the Sardian Bank.
Well, so what was it like turning the reins over to your son, Craig?
Well, fortunately, for me, it was very easy because I never had the reins in the first place. So, and not only that, but Craig has done a much better job than I ever did with the bank. So it's worked out fine.
Was his career coming up in banking, or what had he done before that?
Well, no. Craig graduated from the Arizona State University and came back and has been working in the bank ever since. And it's just a job he liked doing.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk some about your philanthropic endeavors over the years?
Well, you know, I tell people that I had a lot of fun making money, and I'm having a lot of fun giving it away. And there are a lot of things I've been involved in. I think probably the main things are the University of Mary, and in the Medora Foundation. I was on the board of the Medora Foundation probably for 12 or 13 years. And of course that was tremendously satisfying because the Medora Foundation, restoring Medora, had been a tremendous job. And to think that you're walking maybe in the footsteps a little bit of Harold Schaefer is tremendously satisfying because I don't know of anybody that can duplicate what Harold Schaefer did in his business and in talking about philanthropy. Nobody's going to match what Harold did with his money.
Well, your roots are here in North Dakota. As I told you, I only lived here 16 years, but I've fallen in love with it. What is so different about being in North Dakota?
Well, I've always said the people. I worked in high school and college, and before high school even, out in the farm with my folks had. And so many times driving old trucks and hauling machinery and this type of thing, you'd run out of gas or have troubles, whatever. And invariably, people would come by and they would help me. And then when we were through and I could start out again, I'd say, well, what can I do to pay it? They say, well, just help the next person. And this is the spirit in North Dakota. I think probably because we're up until the oil boom and so on, I think that, you know, we were pretty much a pretty poor state, and we've had to rely on one another. And I think that's unique. I think that's something we're losing all the time. But that's what I love about North Dakota.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go back to the book for just a moment. Of course,
you know, I would just say this
yes,
also. My dad, in the 30s, I remember he told me, I was just a little kid, he said, I didn't know why he grew up in Wisconsin, such a beautiful state, did the rest of his life in North Dakota. But he said, North Dakota is the best state in the best country in the world. He said, if there's no future here in North Dakota, there's no future anywhere. And I've always believed that.
Well, that's a good comment and a good statement, probably a good one to end on, but what's been the reaction to the book so far?
Well, hopefully, I talk about my reaction. I've enjoyed reading it myself, and I hope other people have also.
Okay. Well, we thank you for joining us today. We appreciate you being here, and thanks so much.
I certainly appreciate being here. Thank you very much for having me.
If you'd like a copy of the book, it's available at the University of Mary Press. And, well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse for this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funding provided by the members of Prairie Public.